Hey friend, Chris here from LogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Today is an exciting day, and that's because Apple has just dropped not one, but two brand new major versions of each version of Logic Pro. And that comes in the form of Logic Pro for iPad 2, not the iPad 2, but the second version of the app, and Logic Pro for Mac 11. Finally, the Mac version gets turned up to 11. Now maybe you saw last week's Apple event, the Let Loose event, all about the iPad. Or maybe you just seen the news around town. Apple's going headfirst with brand new AI, machine learning, generative features for its Pro applications. And it's really hard to overstate how awesome these features actually are. Even if you're not that excited about AI, I guarantee you there's something for everyone in this update. We're going to start out in Logic Pro for iPad 2, work our way into Logic Pro for Mac 11. Let it be known, this is going to be a long video. There is a ton to cover. So I made sure to chapter out the video so you can easily navigate it. And before we dig in, last thing, public service announcement, please back up your version of Logic Pro before you update on the Mac. And, just back up your system in general using Time Machine. Just get to know these systems. I'll include links down below that will help you get set up with that. All right, without further ado, let's dig into Logic Pro for iPad 2. The headline feature with this set of updates is the introduction of session players to Logic Pro, and that comes in the form of Drummer, plus the brand new bass player and key player. With these three session players, you have your very own generative AI backing band for your music. Now, we've had Drummer ever since the introduction of Logic Pro 10 back in 2013, but Drummer finally has some bandmates. First, Drummer has been completely overhauled. All of the acoustic drum kits have been completely remixed. Apparently, Apple's learned a thing or two over the last 10 years or so when it comes to drums, and the acoustic drum kits are sounding better than ever. The electronic drummers have also been completely overhauled, and not just their kits, which, by the way, all have brand new Drum Machine Designer kits, but the generated performances themselves are much more stylistically appropriate and tasteful. Also, RIP to Kyle, Logan, and the rest of the drummer gang, because their images, names, and profiles have been replaced with just a name and image of styles of drumming instead. On screen, on the left-hand side of the editor, you can see the image and title for the current acoustic drummer I have loaded in my project, this being the Pop Rock kit. By tapping on the image itself, a menu pops up showing you all of the available kits for the acoustic drummer, and it's broken up into categories of style. So you can see rock, songwriter, alternative, and R&B. So first, let's take a listen to the newly remixed SoCal kit in Logic Pro. That sounds pretty awesome to me. Now, if we go down to maybe indie pop and take a listen. Now, going to the top of the pop-up menu, you can choose between different types of session players, whether it be acoustic drummer, electronic drummer, percussionist, bass player, and keyboard player. If we take a listen to the new electronic kits, and I'll choose perhaps the modern hip-hop kit. I mean, these kits sound amazing. But let me navigate back to the Pop Rock kit for now. And let's take a look at the actual controls for Drummer. Previously, you had an XY pad with a puck in the middle that allowed you to switch between soft and loud, simple and complex. These have been replaced with sliders for complexity and intensity. So obviously, by dragging this slider for complexity all the way to the bottom, you get simpler drum beats. By dragging the slider to the top, you get more complex. Whereas dragging the intensity slider to the bottom provides quieter performances. At the top of the slider, the performances are performed at their loudest. Now note, directly beneath the profile image for your drummer, there's this new button that allows you to generate new performances with a click. You don't even have to mess around with patterns. You can just press on this button to change the pattern as many times as you need to. In the middle of the main tab, you can choose between patterns for the kick and snare, or for the cymbals and toms in this case. Whereas before, the pattern chooser would just be a slider that you slide between values like 1 through 8 or 1 through 3. Now you get an actual visual presentation of what kind of pattern you're loading into your regions. Let me choose the first pattern and take a listen. Or perhaps the fourth one. Or I'll go to the eighth. Right, it's a much more clear presentation of what you're actually choosing for your kit elements. At the bottom of the pattern chooser window, you once again have the option to have drummer follow any other track in your project for rhythmic cues for how it should perform. But what's so great about this follow function now is it doesn't replace your pattern choice. So I could choose to have drummer follow my guitar, but I can still pick between different patterns for drummer. So let me turn follow off and take a listen to how this sounds alongside my guitar. All right. And if we now have drummer follow, and if I choose a different pattern, that's awesome. I love that. Also note that session players can not only follow another track, but also the chords in the chord track, which we'll explore later in this video. Of course, you can always choose what kit element drummer is going to perform just by clicking on these kit elements. And you can choose a pattern for your hi-hat, your toms, whatever kit element you're working with. We can turn off the snare or the kick. To the right of the pattern choosers, of course, you have options for fills, how many fills you want to introduce to a region, but there's also a new knob for fill complexity. So how complex or simple do you want your fills to be? So you can see, it's gotten pretty complex right here. Take a listen. Or I could set this all the way down. Right, that's awesome. And of course, we have swing controls for drummer. Now in the middle tab, the details tab, you can once again choose between how much in terms of ghost notes that you want in your performances. So if I add a ton of ghost notes, or none at all, below ghost notes, you have the option to choose what kind of style of snare performance should drummer play. Do you prefer to have drummer automatically determine its style of performance for the snare? Or do you prefer to have it be exactly the center of the snare, or a rim shot, or side stick, or instead play the tom? So if I set this to maybe rim shot, take a listen. Or let's choose the side stick. Or instead have the tom take the place of the snare altogether. From there, you can turn any sort of percussion on or off. So I could choose perhaps a tambourine, shaker, or clap. You can also have a choice of hi-hat, whether it be automatic or closed, half open, open, and wide open. To the right of that, of course, you have the option to push or pull in terms of feel. But now there's a control for dynamics of your drummers. So now you can increase your drummer dynamics or reduce them. And one of my favorite features of this update is the introduction of tempo. So previously with drummer, you had the choice basically with the last two options of the kick and snare to be either halftime or double time. But you couldn't mix and match patterns with double time and halftime. Now you can. Now you can actually choose, hey, I want to play in halftime, but I want to choose a different pattern for halftime. And then right next to that, you have the option for humanize. Basically, how quantized do you want drummer to be? Do you want drummer to be exactly on the grid? Or do you want Drummer to be a little loose in its performance and just automatically updates? After that, we have the manual tab, which I am sure everyone is going to be stoked about. For some of us, the pattern chooser is just not enough control in terms of drum performance, and previously you had to convert a drummer region to MIDI to make any sort of customization to the performance to fit your song. But now with the manual tab, you can just input individual steps like the step sequencer for the kick and for the snare. So let's say I just want a really simple pattern of just the kick and snare alternating back to back. Right, that's perfect for me. I just want to go back and adjust the tempo so it's back at a standard pace. With that, let's introduce one of the brand new session players with bass player. And I'm just going to make sure to load the pop rock version and create. With that, the editor updates to the bass player editor. Bass player is your generative AI bass player, and the sounds have been based on advanced sampling technology. So these performances sound awesome, they sound realistic, plus you have the same degree of control as you do with Drummer. Take a listen to how Bassist sounds. That sounds so awesome. And just like with Drummer, if you tap on the image of the style performance that you're working with, a menu pops up once again with different types of basses that you can choose for styles of rock, songwriter, alternative, and R&B. In fact, if we choose the disco slap bass, take a listen to what this sounds like. That is so sick. I love that so much. Let's return to the pop rock bassist for now. Now taking a look, again, we have complexity and intensity. Whether it be simple or complex, soft or loud, that's pretty self-explanatory. The same with the pattern selection. Again, you have different options for patterns with a visual cue of what pattern you may be choosing for your bassist. So if I choose 5 here, you can see it update. And of course, we can have bassists follow the chord track or another track in the project. To the right of that is fill amount, fill complexity, swing. These are all identical to that of Drummer. But in the middle here, we have some controls that are specific to bassists, starting with melody. Melody is essentially how much you want bass player to walk around the different notes of the scale. Perhaps you want bass player to just play the root note only, and that's it. Now there is some walking around because the fill amount, of course, is introduced, and we have octave. After that, you can choose to have bassists either play around with some notes inside the scale or more notes. After that, you have octaves, either introducing no octaves at all. I'll set this to root for now. Or we can introduce some octaves or more. After that is the option for phrasing. So how short, medium, or long do you want your bass performances to be? At the bottom, you have the choice of what's the lowest note the bassist is going to play. So if perhaps you're playing in a band that plays in a drop tuning, it might be helpful to choose drop D or drop C. On the details page, of course, you have options for feel and dynamics, humanize, and tempo. But in the middle, you have options for dead notes, slides, pickup hits, just these affectations of a bass performance. So let's add some pickup hits and maybe some dead notes as well. And of course, you have manual control as well if the pattern is just not suiting what you're thinking. Just a couple notes. Maybe let's reduce some of these notes. So much versatility here. Now, all of this is made possible by the brand new Studio Bass instrument. And you can see that this presentation of Studio Bass, I think, is really awesome. I think it's really helpful. You get the image of the bass that you're working with, which, by the way, there are 6 deeply sampled basses that you can choose from. All sorts of electric basses, as well as an upright bass. So let me go back to the editor here and turn off my manual pattern. And if I just filter through some of these basses, I think you'll recognize where a lot of the inspiration comes from for these different sounds. Going back to the classic, the next thing I got to point out to you is just watch as this bassist performs. Just take a look at what is noted here under last played. These are all the articulations that bass player is playing as it performs. And as you can see, bass player is doing all sorts of stuff. It is not just one single sample being played over and over again. This is using all the articulations that come with Studio Bass. By default, Studio Bass is set to auto. So bass player is going to use all of the available articulations that make the most sense for the style of performance. As you can see, there is a ton of articulations for Studio Bass. And when you're using bass player, the best option really is just to leave this set to all. But you have all these other articulations if you are going to be performing yourself or programming using Studio Bass. There's also playing style, whether it be with a finger, or pick, or slap. Beyond that, you have controls for mute, as well as definition. There's control for volume and tone, as well as the main volume. Beyond that is a further details page with much more control, as you can see, over scrapes, string noise, hum and hiss. I mean, there's so much to dig through here, so I'm going to leave that to you to dig through it. But just know Studio Bass comes stacked. It sounds awesome, and with bass player, you really have fantastic bass sounds and performances for your music. With that, let's bring in the last of the session players, keyboard player. Again, the editor looks much the same, but with specific controls for just keyboard player. And keyboard player has the option to play freely or broken chords, block chords, arpeggiated, and even synth pads using retro synth. If we take a listen. Now let's try something like block chords. Or even our simple pad. mean, I cannot gush enough about these session players. I think they sound fantastic. I think it's a great launch point for your music. Returning to the block chords, of course, we have many of the similar controls of bass player and drummer. But right in the center again, you have more specific controls to keyboard player, which includes the ability to enable or disable the left or right hand performance. So I could just disclude maybe the right hand altogether. From there, of course, I could choose a pattern for my performance. And I'll also choose to have keyboard player follow my guitar. Underneath is the option to set the range for keyboard player, as in how far up or down the keys the performance goes. So I can set this a bit lower and higher. Underneath that, for each left hand and right hand, you could choose the type of voicing. So for the left hand, it could be the root only, the root in the octave, the fifth in octave. Under style, you can choose between sustain or simple, moderate, complex, follow the right hand, as well as steady eighths. And for the right hand, you have the choice of full chord, or two voice, fixed interval, common tone, three voice common tone, and more. And with movement, you can set it to a minimal range all the way up to a large range. The Details tab offers many of the same controls as the other session players, but we have an option here for grace notes, adding little embellishments to the performance, and phrasing, which can be set to short, accentuated, medium, or sustained. And of course, the Manual tab, if you're not quite happy with the pattern you're receiving with keyboard player. All right, so let me set this back to a pattern. And let's bring up the brand new Studio Piano instrument, which is a brand new instrument plugin that offers you 3 meticulously sampled pianos. That includes a Studio Grand, a Concert Grand, and Vintage Upright. Or you have the option of the Studio Grand with 1 microphone. So let's take a listen to all 3 of these right now. The Concert. And of course, our Vintage Upright. And what's so awesome about the Studio Piano is the level of detail control you have with the instrument. As you saw with some of these different pianos, you have the option to choose between different stereo microphones. So we have stereo mic A, B, and a mono microphone, which can be enabled or bypassed, and you can adjust the level. There's a main volume knob, and at the bottom of the instrument is options for pedal noise, key noise, the release samples, and sympathetic resonance. Now, unlike drummer, bass player and keyboard player need to know what to play, right? If they're not playing the right chords, the right key and scale, they're basically useless. To make all of this possible is the brand new Chord Track in each version of Logic Pro, and it can be found right up here in the global tracks. As you may have noticed earlier in the video, when I loaded bass player into my project, these chords were instantly populated into the Chord Track. They came with bass player. Your session players follow these chord tracks to know what chords to play when in your projects. By double tapping on the Chord Track, you can actually choose between different chord progressions. You can also create or edit your own chords as well, just by pressing on the plus button right here. So maybe I'll place the playhead right here, and I can add a chord. A menu pops up. offering different options to adjust the chord. Perhaps I want to set this to D sharp minor. You can also specify a bass note. So maybe I'll set F sharp. You can also change up the scale, or even input a chord using a controller. And once you're done, just click outside. So I can place another chord here, and so on and so forth, right? So I'll just add another chord. Now, all of these chords right here are part of a chord group, as well as these. You can see they're grouped together. If you double tap on the chord group, you could choose to ungroup the chords. And if you decide to get rid of a chord, tap on it and just delete. The chord track also follows along with any key changes. So if I click on the key signature, and maybe I'll set this to, let's say, D minor, all the chords adapt and the performances adapt. And you can even change a chord within a chord group. So I could change this perhaps to E. Right? And everybody just adapts. It just works. However, your session player regions can have their own chords. Your session players don't have to follow the chord track exactly if you want the bass player or keyboard player to, kind of go on its own riff. To do that, I'll select my bass player region and click again and go down to chords. I'm going to paste the chords from the global track to this bass player region. Right, so we can see the chords now for bass player. And if I open the bass player editor and go to the third tab here, I have this option to change the chords on an individual basis, just for this region, just for the bass player. So I could edit this third chord to be in C minor. And look at that. Let me just quickly point out that chords in the chord track and region chords are not automatically analyzed by Logic Pro. It's not like you can load an audio file and have it analyze the chordal structure of the audio file and then just populate it across the chord track. That's not how it works. It really depends on you to input chords into the chord track or paste chords from either the global track or from the region to the other. So I could paste my region chords from bass player into the chord track at the top. But I just want to emphasize this is not automatically analyzing harmonic content and figuring it out for you. It's really up to you to figure it out. However, many of the Apple loops now have chords built into them. So let me just choose perhaps a MIDI loop. All right, let's now bring in this loop. And you can see this Alphabet City Boundless Bass has its own chord installed into it, D minor. Or if we pull the Epic Pop Piano, awesome. And now we can install these chords into the global track. And everything underneath adapts itself. To make life easier with all this chord data is now the option for pitch source in the region inspector. So let me close the browser, open the inspector, and choose my Epic Pop Piano. And in the region inspector, we now have an option under general for pitch source. Different types of regions have different options for pitch source. In the case of MIDI and pattern regions, you can either set this to off, so your regions will not follow any changes to the key signature of your project, or they can and will follow any key signature changes. Session players have the option to follow either their own region chords or the chord track. Where audio regions do not include an option for pitch source. For projects created in earlier versions of Logic Pro, you have another option, which is project key. So regions will change to match the project key, but will not adapt to any subsequent key signature changes. The next major AI update to Logic Pro for both versions is the introduction of the brand new distortion plugin, ChromaGlow. Now, not immediately obvious, everybody thinks of ChromaVerb, but ChromaGlow is not a reverb. ChromaGlow introduces the sound of tape, tubes, and other coveted analog hardware sound to Logic Pro, and it does this by leveraging AI and machine learning. ChromaGlow offers you 5 different models of analog vibe, starting with Retro Tube, which adds the warmth and vintage ambience of vacuum tube equipment. Then there's Modern Tube, which adds harmonic richness and gentle compression of tube bass gear. Following that is Magnetic, which mimics the saturation and compression of analog tape machines. Squeeze brings you warmth, character, and color of pushing analog compression. And lastly is the Analog Preamp, which brings an assertive and vibrant, punchy sound. So let's take a listen to each of these models and what they bring, starting with Retro Tube. I'll steadily increase the drive, and we'll see what this brings. Right? That sounds pretty sick. Let's hear the before and after. And after. On top of that, you have an option for style for each model. In the case of Retro Tube, I could choose between clean or colorful. Now let's hear the Modern Tube set to colorful. And if I set it to clean. And it sounds not like any distortion Logic Pro has ever had. I love the sound of these. Switching to Magnetic, let's hear what kind of analog tape machines are coming to Logic Pro. Right, so you can dial in any amount of subtle or colorful. Take a listen to Squeeze. The options instead are soft press or hard press because Squeeze is based on compression. Take a listen. And of course, we have to hear the Analog Preamp. Now I'm going to switch it to Squeeze just because I think it sounds pretty cool. Underneath, you have options for low cut and high cut. So you could add a low cut filter either before the drive or after. So if we introduce this. And of course, there's a high cut. In the upper right corner is the option to either drive harder into ChromaGlow. So let me bring this down by an equal amount. And of course, the level out allows you to gain stage after the plugin. There's a mix control. So maybe you just want to dial in a little bit of ChromaGlow's good vibes to your track. And to the left of that is this really awesome option to bypass anything below a set frequency. So maybe the kick drum is just causing ChromaGlow to go crazy. It's just overreacting to the low end of the kick. You can have ChromaGlow completely ignore that end of the spectrum, everything below 120 hertz. Right, so now I'm bypassing up to 320 hertz. I hope you can hear how awesome ChromaGlow is and how much it's going to bring to your projects in terms of depth and saturation and vibe. Also, brand new AI technology introduced to Logic Pro for both iPad and Mac is the brand new stem splitter, which allows you to extract up to 4 different stems from a single audio file. This can be great if you have a voice memo recording of a rehearsal or a show. And there was some magic in there. Wouldn't it be great if you could just reach in and grab the vocal track or use those 4 stems as the basis of an entire production? Well, as it turns out, you can. I'm going to swipe in the Files app. I'm going to grab this audio example and bring it into my project. We can see the entire audio file for the song. It's a buddy of mine who recorded some acoustic guitar and vocals here at my studio, and then I use the session players to add drums, bass, and keys. If we take a quick listen.
From cursing families, toggle between models.
Right, so I'd like to dig in and get to the vocals or the bass or the drums. To do that, let me tap on the region and then tap again. In the menu that pops up, let's go down to Stem Splitter. In the Stem Splitter menu that pops up, you have the option to include or not include up to 4 different stems, which includes the vocals, drums, bass, and any other instrument in the audio file. So I could not include other or include it, right? So for any of these different stem options, let me click Split and take a look. There's our vocals, the drums, the bass, and other. And I gotta say, this was way faster on the M4 iPad Pro than it was on my M1 Mac Mini. So let's take a listen again.
From cursing families, toggle between model citizens and wandering depressed men.
Sounds good to me, but check it out. I have just the vocals.
From cursing families, toggle between model citizens and wandering depressed.
Or just the drums. The bass. And of course, other.
Model citizens and wandering depressed manic things, all their hours joined to fray.
Now, of course, there's a little bit of residual activity between the 4 different stems imprinted between the stems, but Stem Splitter can be a lifesaver when you want to get to a specific element of a recording that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. And also, if we take a look to create a new project, there are, of course, brand new lessons for you to dig into with Chords, Stem Splitter, the different session players. These lessons I find fantastic, and I dig into them myself. Additionally, if you haven't caught it already, there have been new producer packs over the last couple months, including packs from Hardwell, The Count, and Corey Wong. And on top of that, there's a brand new artist project from artist Ellie Dixon with the song Swing. And I gotta say, this song is bananas. I love it. And again, it's available in both updates for Logic Pro, both for iPad and for Mac. All right, we focused on Logic Pro for iPad quite a bit throughout this video. Let's move into Logic Pro for Mac. But again, keep in mind every headline feature that I'm showing you is available in both platforms of Logic Pro. As you can see on screen, I have all 3 session players loaded. If I click on the bass player track, I can load the Studio Bass plugin. If I click on my keyboard player track, we also have the Studio Piano. We also have ChromaGlow. And if I brought in a stereo file that I wanted to stem split, I can right-click and open up Stem Splitter. This next one I think is going to make some folks really, really happy, and that is that you can finally bounce your region or track in place or freeze your track in real time. What this means is if you're using external instruments or external hardware for processing your tracks, you no longer have to route to a bus and then record to a separate track to print those effects into your projects. For example, I have a microcord connected to my audio interface. Using the external instrument plugin, if we solo the track, take a listen. So I have the microcord connected to a MIDI interface, and the audio outputs on the microcord are connected to my audio interface, so we can hear it. But previously, it was a pain in the neck to get this sound into your project as a committed audio file. No longer. Let me select a region. I'll bring up the bounce dialog and check it out. There you have it. The microKORG printed, bounced in place in real time as a brand new audio file and region in the project. Beautiful, and this applies as well to outboard gear. In this case, I have a vocal moment using the I/O plugin routed through a guitar delay pedal. If we take a listen, right? So I want to, again, be able to bounce this in place. So let's bring up the bounce dialog for the region or for the track. In this case, I'll include the audio tail. Check it out. And there we have it. Brilliant. Another new feature in both versions is that you can now route MIDI internally in your projects to other tracks. So what does this mean exactly? Let me bring up a new software instrument. And maybe I've loaded an arpeggiator onto my studio grand piano here. Take a listen. Now, clearly the keyboard player did not perform the arpeggiation. It's playing chords, maybe a couple notes here and there. But I want to record the output of this arpeggiation to a new track. Simple. I'm going to load maybe Alchemy on the separate track. And I'll set this to an organ sound just for something to listen to. With this organ track selected, I'm going to open the track inspector. Now there's a new option for internal MIDI in. If I click on this drop-down menu, now I could choose from an instrument input or an instrument output if you have an instrument that outputs MIDI data, as well as MIDI to track. So in this case, I'll choose my Studio Grand, and let's record. There you go. There's the output right there. Isn't that awesome? The last update that I'll show you for this video, and it is actually specific to Logic Pro for Mac because Logic Pro for iPad doesn't support Atmos at this moment, is the brand new DownMix and trim controls in the Atmos plugin and a new monitoring format. If we take a look under monitoring format here, there's now an option for 5.1.2. Plus, there's a brand new tab for DownMix and trim control, which allows you to customize how your Atmos project will play back on systems that have fewer surround speakers, no height channels, or no surround speakers at all. There are different DownMix modes that you can customize for just by choosing from these drop-down menus. You can also adjust trim controls for 5.1 and 2.0, 5.1.2, 5.1.4, and 7.1. And under mode, typically set to automatic, but if you want to customize the trims for the surround speakers, or the heights, you can adjust their levels for a more comfortable listening experience for these different formats, plus adjust the front to back balance for the overheads and the listener plane. All right, that was so much. I recognize that, but there was a lot to cover. I hope you have a chance to check these out because this update is banging. There's so much here that will add to your creativity and workflow. I am stoked for Logic Pro for iPad 2 and Logic Pro for Mac 11. All right, I'm Chris from Wide Logic Pro Rules. Thanks so much and take care.